Medical kidnapping may have started in 1706, but it's still very much alive and doing evil. Usually because we don't know what it means, how it happens, or what to do. Scary things can happen in the dark, so let's shine some light on this with 2 things you can do right now to protect your family, what medical kidnapping is, and why it's still happening. I'm also sharing stories of several families that have lived through this, and 10 things that you need to know for any medical situation. This will be a 2-episode topic, but knowing how to protect your loved ones is worth it. Welcome to the Cook Who Can't Eat podcast, where chronic illness and family meet at home and in the kitchen. Hello, my friend. I'm so glad that you're here. Do you know what happens or what can happen if medical advocacy turns adversary? We've talked about medical advocacy before, and usually when I do a deep dive or get into the nitty-gritty of these kinds of things, I do it in the Chronic Illness and Disability 101 series. However, this topic affects every single one of us, yet very few know about it, and even fewer are talking about it, because it has been allowed to be very skillfully hidden away in the shadows since 1706. Medical kidnapping. If you've seen the heartbreaking documentary on Netflix called Take Care of Maya, you know a little bit about Maya Kolinsky's case and how failed advocacy and a broken system led to Maya being medically kidnapped at the age of 10 and the death of her mother. These are horrific and heartbreaking consequences, and many are finding this incredibly shocking, and it is, unless you're in the chronic illness community. In our world, you advocate or you die. Even if you do advocate, you still have to walk some imaginary tightrope that, by the way, seems to change with every interaction, every who, what, where, when, why, or even what the weather is of each individual conversation and situation. And if you aren't walking that invisible line perfectly, your life or the life of your loved ones can still be put at risk if you are deemed adversary or bothersome. It's crazy, right? Now, this is a very complex, delicate, and difficult topic to talk about. So I had not planned on doing an episode about this until I listened to Investigator Slater and Tank Sinatra cover Maya's case in their podcast, Psychopedia. Knowing the things that they research for their own podcast and how deeply they dive into anything new and how educated they are on such a wide variety of things. As I listened to the episode, I realized that there is a real lack of information out there about all of this. Their shock and disbelief over Maya's situation really concerned me. But listening to them theorize on what they might do in that situation terrified me. I was actually like mom voice talking to my speaker, talking to them. It was like the audio version of watching your kid run out into the street without looking both ways. They were covering it wonderfully, but I just kept thinking that if they were surprised by what they found and didn't know that this was happening everywhere, all the time, to every kind of person for an endless list of reasons, what about everybody else? Does the general public know and understand how easily this can happen to them or their loved ones? By the way, if you like true crime, even just a little bit, you have to check out their show. I love it. They're incredible storytellers. They discuss some really interesting, though sometimes gruesome cases. And Investigator Slater always makes sure that the research they share is deep and wide. Somehow they managed to talk about some very horrific stories with incredible care and tact and nothing but the utmost respect for the victims and their families. Really impressive. I think that's why their obvious heartbreak and dismay over what happened to Maya and her family, plus their genuine concern about this happening to others, is what made me want to do this episode. Their logo is a skull with neon colors, and it's called Psychopedia. Now, I'm not affiliated with them. I don't know them. They don't know me. I just really like their podcast. If you do check it out, let me know because I need a true crime buddy. Okay, back to our conversation. Here's the thing about chronic and rare illnesses. Most of them are invisible, but that doesn't make them imaginary. When you do see something like a hand tremor or trouble talking, you aren't seeing the disease. You're seeing a symptom, and symptoms can vary drastically from person to person. So, how do you tell someone that you're sick when you can't really prove it? How do you live when survival feels impossible? How do you convince doctors to keep going and to look deeper when they're just trying to say, oh, you're fine, it's normal, whatever? How do you advocate when you don't even know what you don't know? Most importantly, how do you make educated medical decisions or say no to those that believe that they know best and have the power to force their will on you or your family? This space where those questions come up, that's where tragedy lives. It's where everything turns gray. It's where a patient and a provider's interests can clash. This is where sometimes your best case is a poor patient outcome, and the worst case is medical kidnapping or death. One thing to remember is that medical kidnapping is not a consequence only suffered by children, and it's been on the rise over the last few decades. We've seen it represented in documentaries, Netflix specials like the one on Maya, or even movies like I Care a Lot and A Fall from Grace. Regardless of the age of the patient, this reality looms over all of us because the guidelines around it are conveniently very open to interpretation by the treating physicians and even family services or child protective services. But it doesn't spell out what rights the family has or how to argue against whatever interpretation is being used. When it comes to minors, medical kidnapping occurs when the state takes children from their parents and puts them into state or hospital custody simply because the doctor and the parents disagree over the medical care or treatment that the child should receive. The state can keep these children in the hospital, place them in foster care or in a group home. They can even put them up for adoption. And parents aren't always granted visitation rights. I think one of the best explanations I've heard about what medical kidnapping can be actually came from Saisha Mercado, who was a victim. Well, her kids were victims. Really, the whole family were victims of medical kidnapping. She was a finalist on American Idol, a Broadway performer, and I share more of her story a little later, but this is what she said. My son was forcefully and legally kidnapped by CPS, who claim we refused a B12 shot that was a matter of life and death, which is an absolute lie. We never refused a B12 shot, and at no point was he on the verge of death. She later explained that if you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, aunt, uncle, cousin, whatever, if you are involved in raising a child, just know that the US has agencies and rules in place that have the ability to remove your child from you without you ever breaking the law or any proof of abuse. If this can happen to us, it can happen to you. We have no criminal background. We have no history with DCF. We have done nothing wrong. I was just a mother who needed assistance with something that is very common amongst mothers, and what's been done to my family is unacceptable. It's sickening. I have to agree. Most family courts strongly favor parents maintaining custody and control over their children. But once a medical facility or a provider gets involved, that preference tends to go right out the window, and the courts seem to strongly favor the medical provider or the state's opinion. That can drop your family into sometimes a deadly legal minefield. If the doctor feels strongly enough, even before they get a court order, they can have parents escorted out of the building and off the property by the police, all while continuing to treat your child in whatever way they see fit without your consent or knowledge. And while all that's happening, the state will start moving very quickly to gain legal custody of your child. That gives them the right to make all medical decisions. And typically, the state will just default to whatever the doctor or provider or facility recommends. Pulling sick children away from their parents under the guise of protecting them from alleged abuse and neglect is beyond cruel. Many times, these sick and now defenseless children end up in situations that actually do cause them to become victims of real physical, mental, emotional, even medical abuse. Not to mention the severe psychological trauma that comes from being ripped away from their family and their home. Most parents will fight to the death to protect their children from any and all danger. What catches us off guard is when the danger comes from those that we thought we could trust and who we had depended on to take care of our child or our family member. Now, parents have to figure out ways to temper their advocacy in case someone chooses to make a false claim against them because they just don't agree. That fear, added on top of trying to take care of a sick child, is indescribable. When the state or a hospital takes control of an elderly or disabled individual, the results can be just as traumatizing. And depending on the age and their health, it can lead to patient injury and even death. Not to mention the reality that they typically have a lot of medical issues, and the guardians are not required to follow their wishes or the wishes of the patient's family. They can even override or make null and void medical powers of attorney and living wills. My guess is you're asking yourself these two questions right now, so let me just answer them. First, you're probably wondering if you don't have a chronic or life-threatening illness or kids. Does this really apply to you? Yes, 1000%. This applies to you, to me, to all of your loved ones, and everyone you will ever meet. It is so important that everyone understands what this is, why it's happening, and how it can happen. Your second question, is this just another bashing of our medical system or our state family services system? Why are we always bashing them? Absolutely not. We are talking about a very serious and a scary topic that affects everyone. And while this process usually does begin with a medical provider, the best thing we can do is educate ourselves and those around us about what this is, why it's happening, how it happens, how to prevent it, and what to do if, God forbid, it does happen to you. The people who work in these systems have impossible jobs. And I truly want to believe that every single one of them, if they make that call, if they try and separate someone from their family, they're doing it with the absolute best intentions. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. I do know that I've never met a first responder or doctor or nurse that doesn't have at least one case that just haunts them. Sometimes it's because they thought they saw something, and sometimes it's because they didn't listen to their instinct. When you're seeing the worst of the worst all the time, isn't it easier to see the worst everywhere you look? Their jobs aren't easy. And while these few don't represent the whole, it's important for people to understand that sometimes people that are supposed to help hurt instead. Medical kidnapping is happening more often than most people realize because it's typically very nicely hidden away. And I hate to say it, but if Maya's family had not experienced such horrific consequences, we probably wouldn't have heard much about it. I want to point out two things to you that you can do right now that will help you and your family in the long term. First, interview potential physicians. Having a trusted primary care physician that understands your history, your family, your child, any care you're receiving, they just know you. That's like having an ace up your sleeve at a poker game. Ask about their practices, their care and patient beliefs, and their views on medical decisions and the rights of parents to make those decisions. Don't be shy. Go ahead and ask the direct and hard questions because you need the answers. The doctors who don't want to answer them are not going to be the doctors in your corner when you need them most. The second thing you can do right now is talk to your friends and family. make sure that they understand how you think about things medically and that you know how they think. For instance, if you are a big believer in alternative medicine, you're going to want to be careful around friends or family who are die-hard Western medicine supporters. You don't have to cut them out of your life, but maybe avoid conversations about medications or treatments, alternative lifestyles, or food plans that they could possibly have a negative reaction to. Unfortunately, many CPS investigations start with an anonymous call from a bitter or angry friend or family member. So if you know how they feel, they know how you feel, you can make sure you keep your conversations in the safe zone. There are many theories on the whys of medical kidnapping. One theory is that many of these patients, especially the pediatric ones, are often suffering from rare or chronic conditions or diseases. Treating them creates a very unique opportunity to study and to even test these lesser known ailments, which can generate not just a lot of excitement and knowledge, but money. The kind of money that people and institutions might not be willing to give up. If the state takes custody, they can allow them to be enrolled in medical testing, in experimental treatments, in clinical studies, or any other medical research activities without the patient or parents' knowledge or agreement. Other theories include physicians that are trying to avoid malpractice lawsuits, insurance billing strategies, good old-fashioned God complexes, and other seemingly insignificant reasons to put a patient and a family through something like this. When one side has the ability to interpret or create whatever definition works best for whatever narrative they are looking to create, it makes it very hard for a family or a patient to fight back. Doctors and healthcare providers are specially educated to do these jobs. While they may be an expert in some things, they're not an expert in you or your child or your family. That's you. You are the world's only expert. And that is one of the most important things to remember. Because as much as you want to trust them and listen to them, you also have to start learning how to trust and listen to yourself. If you're in a hospital, a specialist office, or physician's office, and those mama bear or papa bear senses are tingling and saying, warning, 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 red flags, listen to them. If you and your child's physician are arguing, find a way to stop the argument and remove yourself from the situation as quickly as you can. We're going to talk a lot more about that after I share a few stories with you, stories that demonstrate the scope of this epidemic and how vastly different the circumstances can be. Some of these are my stories, some are stories you may have heard from before, and others are stories that have been covered up for way too long. After that, I'm going to come back to discuss warning signs, things we can proactively do so that we know what to watch for, ideas on how to prevent medical kidnapping, and what to do if that unimaginable happens. I have always believed that everyone has a story to tell and that everyone's story deserves to be heard. I hope you'll take the time to listen to these stories. These patients and these families have faced a lot, and they've come out the other side one way or another and have been vulnerable enough to put their story out there. This is a really important topic, and I want to hear your thoughts and your stories. However, if you leave a comment, please be respectful. Remember that everyone in each one of these stories, whether you believe them to be good or bad, are real people with real loved ones who are just trying to do the best they can in the life that they have. To borrow Pink Sinatra's line that kicks off stories on Psychopedia, without further ado. Since I mentioned it earlier, let's talk about Maya Kwilinski's case. At age 9, Maya got sick and just didn't get better, as is the case with most chronic illness patients. After lots of research and doctors and persistency, they discovered that Maya suffered from complex regional pain syndrome, CRPS. It's a rare neurological condition that causes excruciating pain in response to sometimes even the slightest touch. They were able to get her some relief with very specialized ketamine treatments and had built a care team that really understood her diagnosis, the treatments, her situation, Maya, and their family. Unfortunately, in October of 2016, Maya, who was 10 at the time, woke up in a horrific flare. After hours of unimaginable pain and a complete inability to get it under control, her parents took her to Johns Hopkins Hospital in hopes of finding her a little relief. Maya's mother, Beata, who was a registered nurse, did what most mothers would do. She tried to explain Maya's condition, her treatment plan, the doctors currently treating her, and as much background as she could. The hospital had no interest in anything she had to say. Instead, the staff at Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida, notified Child Protective Services, reporting their unsubstantiated belief that Beata was making her daughter sick and then insisting on aggressive treatment because she had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a mental disorder in which a caretaker fakes or makes symptoms worse so that a child appears to be sicker than they really are. Oblivious to what the staff was doing, Beata left the hospital that evening telling Maya she loved her and that she would see her the next day. Maya never saw her mother again. A judge ordered her into state protective custody and away from her family while the allegations were investigated. During this time, all communication between mother and daughter was controlled, dictated, and monitored by hospital staff. In one of many court appearances, Maya pleaded with the judge to speak to him privately and to hug her mom. Sadly, the judge denied both requests. Beata was a registered nurse and a mom who had spent the better part of 2 years trying to get the care her daughter needed. Distraught over being kept from her daughter and the awful allegations that were being levied against her, Beata couldn't take it any longer and committed suicide on January 7, 2017. Maya's father was allowed into the 10-year-old's hospital room to give her the tragic news, but was only allowed to stay and comfort her for 1 hour. She was then left to grieve this horrendous loss all alone. It took 87 days for a judge to finally order Johns Hopkins to return Maya back to her family. Here's what happened during the 87-day investigation. Numerous attempts to intervene by Maya's regular doctors were ignored. The family was forced to spend large amounts of money on legal fees. Maya was left all alone for hours at a time to lay there in excruciating pain. Beata's life was tragically lost, and her daughter was left to process it all alone. And not a single piece of evidence was ever found of abuse, neglect, or Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Recently, Maya and her family won a court judgment against Johns Hopkins Hospital. However, no judgment, no amount of money, nothing can ever bring back everything that family lost when their attempt to advocate was seen as being adversary. Sarah Hirschberger was a 10-year-old Amish girl whose family had to flee the United States in 2013 to avoid hospital demands and a court order that would force Sarah to undergo a 2-year drug trial of experimental chemotherapy against her and her parents' wishes and against the advice of other health experts. You see, Sarah was now 100% free from the leukemia she had been fighting. Originally, the parents supported the hospital's advice of chemotherapy, but when the second round was set to begin, a nurse sent Sarah home with the drugs, but warned her parents that no one else should take these or touch them because they could cause cancer. Sarah was so sick. She could not even get out of bed. The drugs were killing Sarah faster than any leukemia could. When they went to the hospital for their next appointment, they informed the doctor they were going to discontinue chemotherapy at this time. The family was escorted into a conference room where they were berated by medical staff. The doctor said that if Sarah did not continue treatment, she would die within a couple of months. When it was clear the parents would not give in to their fear tactics, the doctor threatened to take them to court for child abuse. However, Sarah was already improving without the drugs. Her family even offered to bring her into the hospital for regular checkups so they could monitor her condition. The doctor and the hospital refused. The family was finally able to leave the hospital that day once they signed a statement that said that they would have a medical doctor look after Sarah. Unbeknownst to the family, the hospital decided to follow through on their threat to engage Child Protective Services, but CPS refused. Next, they tried filing a case against the parents in probate court. But after testimonies, the judge ruled that the parents were looking out for the best interest of their daughter and that the hospital had no jurisdiction to remove the child from her family. Refusing to give up, the hospital tried again with CPS and they were again denied, even though at this point they have gone way past the point of absolute lunacy. The hospital appealed the probate judge's decision in the Court of Appeals. A multi-judge panel refused to grant custody of Sarah to the hospital. So what did the hospital do? They appealed again. Now in the 9th District Court of Appeals, which threw the case back to the original judge in probate court. And once again, that judge refused to award custody to the hospital. Somehow, I still cannot figure this out, but somehow the hospital was allowed to appeal again to the 5th District Court, but they refused to hear the case. So what did they do? They appealed again. Sarah had repeatedly been reported as cancer-free by this point. When the family asked the doctor what would he do now that she is cancer-free, he replied that he is still going to put her back on the chemotherapy for preventative purposes. The family had already been warned that if you come in contact with these drugs, or if you take these drugs and you don't have cancer, these drugs will give you cancer. So the question is, why? This all just seems so crazy. Why would they keep pushing, even with all these denials? Why were they even allowed to keep going? Here's what finally came out. David Michael of the Journal of Natural Food and Health reported that Sarah was actually part of an experimental trial of a new chemotherapy drug. The hospital stood to lose substantial funding, as much as $1 million or more, for ending the drug trial too soon because it would not be treating Sarah for the full 110 weeks that the study required. It's believed that this was the motivation for their desperate attempts to gain custody of Sarah so that they could continue her treatment, whether she needed it or not, so the trial could continue and nobody lost this incredible amount of funding. It's also interesting to note that the doctor who was overseeing Sarah's case and who was really driving and pushing all of this, he only worked at Akron's hospital part-time. He actually held positions at 4 other Ohio hospitals. On top of that, in their desperate attempts to gain custody of Sarah, Akron's Children's Hospital testified that she would die within a couple of months without chemotherapy, even though she's been given a clean bill of health. The parents were apparently forewarned by their attorney that somehow, after all of these denials, the hospital had found some judge in a probate court that would side with them, even though all these judges, all these courts, even Child Protective Services were all saying the parents were in the right and the doctors were in the wrong. This 4-month ordeal was so overwhelming and so traumatizing that before that judge could make their ruling, the family left the country. Sarah did receive treatment in Europe, where she was then declared cancer-free, which was verified 3 times by 3 separate teams using various scans and lab tests. After several years, Sarah and her parents finally did return to the United States very quietly and started putting their lives back together as best they could after this horrible ordeal. It's really sad to think that anyone would want a 10-year-old's reward for beating cancer to be 2 years of the most aggressive and harsh experimental chemotherapy. Scott and Jody Ferris were excited to welcome a new baby to their family. In the media, they referred to the infant as Annie to protect her identity, so that's what I'll do here as well. Jody went into early labor, but there was no stopping Annie. She was coming, ready or not. Since the baby was early, their midwife recommended altering their home birthing plan and encouraged them to call an ambulance and go to the hospital. Jody gave birth to their beautiful baby girl in the ambulance in the parking lot of Hershey Medical Center, a government-run hospital in Pennsylvania. Hospital personnel met them at the ambulance and took charge of both baby and mom. Due to the odd delivery location and circumstances, Jody was not able to see Annie right after she was born. She immediately began asking questions to the nurses and the staff, paramedics, anyone and everyone. How is my baby doing? How is she doing? For some reason, her questions were mostly ignored, and no one would really tell her anything other than she's in good hands and you'll be able to see her soon. Not knowing where her baby was and the lack of communication was really concerning Jody. It was scaring her. So when they started to give her an injection, she asked, "Why and what is it?" All she got was the same vague answer. In fact, they didn't even ask her if she was allergic to any medications until after they'd already given her the shot. Eventually, a doctor told them that Annie had scored a 9 out of 10 on the newborn APGAR test, and anything above an 8 is considered healthy. However, a couple hours later, a different doctor told the parents that Annie was very sick and would need to stay in the hospital. An hour after that, Jody finally got to meet her new baby when another hospital staffer finally brought Annie into her, saying, "Your baby is doing good. She'll be able to go home in no time." Several hours after meeting Annie for that first time, yet another hospital staff member told Scott and Jody that Annie would have to stay in the hospital for 48 to 72 hours for observation, and the only explanation that they were willing to provide was that the law requires us to keep the baby for 48 hours. When the parents asked where could they find this supposed law, they were directed to the risk management office. If you haven't already guessed it, there is no law that requires the state of Pennsylvania to keep an infant for 48 hours. Risk management explained that even though they didn't see anything wrong with Annie, they just like to keep their babies for 48 to 72 hours, and until that time had passed, it would be unsafe for her to leave the hospital. Eventually, Jody got the real story from another risk management staffer who sympathized with the parents. The risk that was being managed was not the health of Annie, but the risk that the hospital might get sued if something went wrong after she discharged. Everyone finally agreed that a 24-hour stay would be satisfactory and that Jody and Scott could remain with the baby overnight. All was settled and good until a social worker showed up to conduct an investigation. Jody asked what the allegations were and was told that it would be illegal for the state to tell Jody why they were investigating. Jody made it clear that she would not be comfortable answering any questions if she didn't understand why she was being questioned. She had just given birth, she was exhausted, and did not have access to a lawyer or even her husband. The social worker's response was nasty. She threatened Jody, saying that if you're not going to cooperate, I'll just go ahead and call the police. We're going to take custody of your baby right now. Terrified of this threat, Jody agreed to cooperate. As the social worker questioned Jody, it became clear that the allegation was that Jody had refused to consent to life-saving medical treatment for her baby. Since Annie's life had never been in danger, the whole situation didn't make any sense. The social worker informed Jody that she had refused to allow the hospital to give Annie a vitamin K shot. The problem is no one ever asked her about this, and the hospital had already given the injection to Annie without either parent's consent. Shortly after this so-called interview, the hospital asked to check Annie's white blood cell count and to perform a strep test. Jody agreed, again fearing the social worker's threat. Then the hospital demanded to give Annie a shot for hepatitis B. This time, Jody said she would only agree if they tested her or Annie to see if either one of them were positive. If so, then she would be willing to consent. The hospital claimed that they had forgotten to do this earlier when it was possible to test that same day, and that they needed to give the shot to Annie immediately. Asking to wait until her husband was back only made the social worker press harder. She not only renewed her threat of taking Annie away, she started adding odd demands like requiring a safety plan. When Jody responded that her husband and an attorney would need to look at any kind of plan before signing it, the social worker left the room and called the police. Acting without a court order, the social worker took immediate custody of Annie by falsely claiming that she was suffering from illness and injury. The social worker consented to the Hep B shot for Annie without testing and had the police force Jody out of her hospital bed and escort her to the hospital entrance. It was then that she and her husband were told that they were now banned from the hospital because she had not signed a safety plan. However, they would allow Jody to return to nurse the baby throughout the night. The police then escorted the couple without their new baby to their car and off the hospital property. Jody and Scott spent the night in their car in the parking lot of a nearby Walmart so that they could comply with the property ban while still staying close enough that Jody could go back and nurse every 3 hours. Can you imagine this? She gave birth less than 24 hours ago. She is in pain. She is exhausted. Hormones are racing through her body, and she has no idea where her baby is or how she's being treated. She should be being cared for by trained postpartum nurses, resting, bonding with her baby, and recovering from this early and whirlwind birth. Instead, she's trying to sleep in a car in a parking lot after being told that her baby was sick, and then healthy, and then sick, and then healthy, and then maybe sick. It seemed like the people who were in charge of her daughter's care were just trying to gaslight her into believing that she refused some kind of treatment and that she was now somehow harming Annie by simply asking questions. Her punishment for that was being pulled from a hospital bed and kicked out of the hospital without her baby. Want to guess what happened next? Jody dragged her beat up, bloody, exhausted body to the maternity floor every 3 hours. However, the staff decided to only allow access to Annie sporadically and not every 3 hours as agreed upon or as is necessary for a newborn. After a nightmare 24 hours, a judicial officer agreed to hear the hospital's case against Jody and Scott. After hearing the evidence and everything the hospital had to say, he ordered the immediate return of Annie to her parents and for no other interference for any reason by the social worker or hospital staff, and restored full custody of Annie to her parents. Luckily, the judicial officer and the court was able to see fact from fiction in this case, but that doesn't always happen, and no parent and no child should be put through this. Not only is it not a crime to ask questions about the well-being of your child, it's also not a crime to ask for testing or explanations to ensure that procedures and medications are necessary. In fact, asking questions and doing these things is the very definition of parenting. Although it probably didn't feel like it at the time, Jody and Scott were really lucky that they were only separated from their daughter for one night. But the trauma of that will be felt for a long time to come. In 2014, Erica and her husband Cleve decided to give birth to their full-term twins at home in Washington. The twins were easily delivered into the waiting arms of their parents, with big brother Levi standing by ready to meet them. Erica described the home birth as exquisite, even empowering, and there were no complications. To appease family members, they did agree to allow paramedics to come by and check everything out. When they arrived, they found 2 healthy newborn infants already successfully nursing. Everyone looked happy, healthy, but as paramedics do at the end of their visit, they recommended they follow up with a hospital or a doctor. The parents did decline and explained that they didn't want to expose their infants to the hospital environment. They were planning on keeping the babies home for at least the first 6 weeks of life to let their natural immune system build up. Paramedics saw no problem with this and left. The next day, a couple of CPS workers were at their door saying that they were just there to help. Finding nothing amiss, 3 healthy babies and a happy family, the only thing that one of the social workers seemed concerned about was some healing eczema on older brother Levi's arm. Erica explained in detail the home remedies she was using to heal the eczema, as well as the elimination diet they were using to figure out what caused the eczema to begin with. Even though it was obviously healing, the social worker was very critical of Erica's decision to not use steroids on her 11-month-old. That same CPS agent would later testify that the mom refused to treat it at all. The only other request that CPS had was to take the twins to see a pediatrician. To get along and just appease everyone, Erica and Cleve went against their better judgment and their decision to keep the twins home for 6 weeks and took the babies to a pediatrician. That doctor said everyone looked wonderful, very healthy, but he did recommend that they supplement a little bit of formula since Erica was still trying to build up her supply now that she was nursing 3 babies. Erica and Cleve did exactly that. The babies responded wonderfully and everything was great until a couple weeks later when CPS was at her door again, and this time it was to take all 3 of her babies. They were citing neglect of Levi for not using steroids to treat his eczema, that the natural home birth was not done in a safe or healthy manner, and they even made never before heard claims of abuse. After the children were taken by CPS, Levi contracted pneumonia and then was diagnosed with behavioral problems because he screamed and cried constantly. Probably because you just ripped him away from his parents and his siblings, and he's not even 1 year old yet. Since the state had custody, they were allowing his behavioral problems to be medicated. Cleve and Erica were awarded supervised visitation. However, there never seemed to be a social worker available during their visitation time. They ended up having to miss Levi's first birthday and many other special moments with their 3 kids. A judge finally allowed the parents to have their children back, but only with several conditions, since he was giving them a second chance and that he wouldn't hesitate to take the kids away if they didn't comply. He set stipulations and rules on how they should raise their family, what the kids could or could not eat, where they should live, and what kind of medical care they were and were not allowed to utilize moving forward. The judge warned them that CPS would check on them and compliance is not up for debate. This was a huge disappointment and burden to the young and still brand new parents, especially when you consider the fact that the couple was never charged with any crime and there was no evidence of abuse, neglect, or medical harm done by either parent. There was so much concern about this mom having a healthy delivery of her twins at home, but no one raised an eyebrow when Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes announced in 2005 that they intended to follow the birthing instructions of the Church of Scientology. No one intervened in 2011 when John Travolta and Kelly Preston announced the same thing. In fact, there were numerous interviews with the couple about this alternative birthing process. In case you don't know, according to Scientology's founder, L. Ron Hubbard, the birthing method preferred by the Church of Scientology states, after a home delivery that's as calm and as no talk as possible, the baby should be wrapped somewhat tightly in a warm blanket, very soft, and then left alone for a day or so. To each their own, but I had to choose an unconventional way to give birth. I'm pretty sure I'd pick the birth where my kids were delivered to love, music, and open arms rather than one where I have to wrap the baby up and leave it alone for a day or so. But that's just me. Interesting how one unconventional home birth garnered the attention of the state and a judge who is now dictating the terms of their parenting, and the other was entertainment news. Trigger warning. This one's a doozy and has about every trigger there is. After a leg amputation and years of searching for help, Michelle Ryder and her 16-year-old son Isaiah traveled from Kansas City, Missouri to Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago in hopes that a new surgery the doctors were offering could treat Isaiah's neurofibromatosis. Difficult thing to say, but it's an even more painful condition that causes tumors to grow on his nerves. The surgery was initially successful and the family was thrilled, but when complications started to arise, the hospital was completely unable to control Isaiah's pain. Eventually, the uncontrolled pain was just too much to bear, and the family decided they wanted to transfer Isaiah to another hospital. The doctors did not like that idea. After multiple attempts to convince Isaiah and his mom, Michelle, to stay at Lurie failed, instead of helping them arrange transfer, they reported Michelle to Chicago's Department of Family Services with accusations of Munchausen's by proxy, claiming that she exaggerates his pain and symptoms so that she can over-medicate him. They further claimed that this is why Michelle changed Isaiah's doctor so often, because it was the easiest way for her to continue abusing her son. Shockingly, a judge ruled that Isaiah would be placed in the custody of Chicago's Cook County Family Services and would remain in their protective medical custody while an investigation could be completed. At this point, you need to remember two things. First, Isaiah is suffering from an incredibly painful and chronic condition. He depends on his mom for his care and his advocacy. Second, Isaiah and his family don't live in Chicago or in Illinois. They were only there for the surgery, or so they thought. They live in Missouri, and the judge refused to allow the case to be transferred there. The judge claimed that he heard convincing medical testimony that led him to this decision. However, the convincing information was never shared with Michelle or her attorney. Michelle denied all allegations against her. She pointed out that the hospital had placed Isaiah in the ICU for 30 days trying to control his pain, that she was a trained and registered hospice nurse for 16 years. And when asked point blank if she had ever interfered with treatment, she said, "I never interfered with Isaiah's care or treatment in any way, sort, or fashion." She also stated, "I did not want, nor did I at any time request that Isaiah have heavy medications. It was quite the opposite, as heavy narcotics did not appear to be helping at all." Illinois DCFS seized 16-year-old Isaiah on April 15, 2014, medically kidnapping him to place him in protective medical custody, foster care. They selected a foster home in Dolton, Illinois, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America at the time. Although it was never confirmed, it's believed Isaiah was placed there because it is a predominantly African-American neighborhood, and Isaiah does have dark skin because of his triracial Black, white, and Native American genealogy. While in DCFS's protective medical custody, Isaiah was raped, sodomized, and regularly held at gun and knife point. He reported the following to his caseworker, his guardian ad litem, and the authorities. A man he had never seen before confronted him and held a gun to his head. He forced him to chew a white pill, and as Isaiah became dizzy, the man forced himself on the boy, sodomized him, and did other things to him. Isaiah passed out. When he woke up, he was extremely sore. The man was gone, but Isaiah said he was surrounded by other people who were laughing and pointing at him, calling him pretty boy. The terrified teen found his way back to his foster home, where he tried to hide and block out the horrible abuse that had just happened. He also reported that guns and knives were regularly pulled on him, and he was suffering from post-traumatic stress events and symptoms, all of which were very well documented. During his next inpatient hospital stay, an investigator reportedly came to the hospital to take his statement about these events. But nothing was ever done. No official report, no medical exam, no investigation. Before being discharged, Isaiah learned that he'd be returning to Chicago foster care, and he pleaded to not return to the area where he had been so violently and horrifically assaulted. His guardian ad litem, Kim Boone, the person that the state of Illinois decided could make better decisions about Isaiah's well-being than his mom, not only ignored Isaiah's desperate pleas, but without a court order, she forced him into an ambulance for transfer back to foster care and had the hospital administer an extra dose of Valium so that Isaiah would be too drugged to really fight back. There are a lot of theories on why this happened. Everything from Lori's needing Michelle out of the way so they could enroll Isaiah into a medical research study, because children who are wards of the state can legally be entered into drug trials and medical research studies without their parents' knowledge or permission. Some believe Isaiah was the control subject, and that's why he was frequently refused pain medication and pain management. Others suspect it was an effort to prevent a malpractice suit against the doctors at Lori because as long as he was a ward of the state, he was unable to file a lawsuit. Regardless of the motivation, it was clear that Illinois' DCFS was going to go to great lengths to keep Isaiah in their custody. Eventually, Isaiah was able to reside with his grandparents in Missouri. However, Illinois was still controlling his life. He wasn't allowed to travel anywhere without his grandparents. He couldn't see his mom for more than 4 hours a week. Illinois social workers would come by for random visits with the threat that if they ever found something not to their liking, they would take Isaiah back to Chicago and place him in their foster care system. Isaiah even had to get their pre-approval for any medical care, even just a routine checkup, and they denied pretty much everything. Only bright spot that Isaiah and his family were clinging to was the fact that soon Isaiah would be 18, a legal adult, and therefore free of Illinois DCFS, or so they thought. His social worker informed him that if he tried to move out of his grandparents' home, move out of state, or even travel out of state after he turns 18, he would be arrested. Unsure of the reason, it was made very clear that there would be serious repercussions for Isaiah if he tried to escape or get out from under the control of DCFS even after his 18th birthday. Eventually, even the state had to admit enough is enough. And after 766 days, Isaiah was finally free from the death grip that the Illinois Department of Family Services had on him and his life. He still has a chronic medical condition, and he continues to work through the trauma caused by being medically kidnapped and the abuse he endured while in their protective custody. At least now he has his mom, Michelle, by his side, who, by the way, was never arrested or charged with any crime, and no evidence of abuse was ever found. In March of 2011, 10-year-old Jacob was diagnosed with cancer. After chemo and radiation, his cancer went into remission. However, his doctors wanted him to continue receiving these treatments as a preventative measure, something both Jacob and his parents had absolutely no interest or intent on doing. Rather than work on a care plan to watch for future issues, the hospital filed an emergency order requesting custody of Jacob, saying that Jacob would have a 0% chance of survival if he didn't continue chemo and radiation, even though he was in remission. The family had 4 different PET scans showing that his body was completely cancer-free. They wanted to focus on building his immune system back up, helping him to regain some healthy weight, helping his body heal from all of that poison that had been pumped into him and used to expel the cancer. They also wanted to give him time to mentally recover from everything he had been through. Jacob was so terrified of being forced to continue with treatment that he told his family and doctors that if they make him do chemo and radiation again, then he would just kill himself. Sadly, that did not stop the doctors from filing petition after petition after petition. Eventually, they went to trial, and the family was prepared to show how Jacob's body was cancer-free and what could happen if he continued with treatments. He was getting PET scans every 3 months and was showing cancer-free even up to the week before the trial. At trial, not a single piece of evidence could be found or presented to substantiate the false claims of medical neglect and abuse that the doctors tried to levy against Jacob's parents. Luckily, the judge agreed with the family and ruled against the state and the hospital, allowing Jacob's family to take the lead on all of his medical decisions without interference. In his ruling, the judge said, the court concludes as a matter of law that Jacob's parents have not been negligent in making decisions about Jacob's course of treatment. These decisions are better made in a clinical setting without resorting to the courts. This is a physician-parent issue. The court should only become involved if an impasse is reached. This court does not find such an impasse here that the state should have intervened and the family subjected to the rigor and uncertain outcome of a jury trial. American Idol finalist and Broadway performer Saisha Mercado and her partner Tyron lost custody of their 13-month-old son after she took him to Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital in St. Petersburg, Florida on March 11, 2021 for dehydration that was a result of his struggle to transition from breast milk, which is a very normal experience. According to Saisha, my son was forcefully and legally kidnapped from us by CPS, who claimed we refused a B12 shot that was a matter of life and death, which is an absolute lie. We never refused a B12 shot, and at no point was he on the verge of death. Saisha said when he was with us, he never had a cold, never had a fever, never had a runny nose. I was just a mother who needed assistance with something that is very common amongst mothers, and what has been done to my family is unacceptable. It's sickening. I have to agree. Saisha's son was assessed by Dr. Sally Smith, who we now know was the subject of a USA Today network investigation that discovered more than a dozen instances of Smith's cases where charges against parents were found to be false, charges dropped, or the parents were acquitted after she claimed the children were being abused or neglected by their parents. In these types of cases, Florida's standard procedure is to work with the family in an effort to place the children with family or family friends. In this case, the hospital chose to discharge their son to a white foster family without any explanation or even telling the parents. Saisha and her partner were escorted from the hospital property and permanently banned. Eventually, her son was moved to the care of a family member, but it was someone who had been estranged from the family for a long time. For months, Saisha and her partner were fighting to regain custody of their son. 5 months after Saisha's son had been taken by CPS, she gave birth to her little girl. Only 10 days after giving birth, the sheriff and his deputies pulled their car over and surrounded them as they demanded she surrender her days-old baby immediately. The couple live streamed the entire incident. In the video, you can see Saisha holding the infant as she begs the deputies not to take her. You can hear her sobbing and begging the officers, how can you guys do this? Don't you feel anything? My baby is 10 days old and you're taking her? You're taking my brand new baby away. You have no heart. This is so wrong. It is heartbreaking. The only explanation that the deputies would provide the couple was that they did not inform authorities that she had given birth while in the midst of this legal battle. The parents repeatedly tell the deputies that all communication was supposed to go through their attorney, and the deputies had not done that. Their baby had just gone for a checkup the day before and received a clean bill of health. The video goes on for more than an hour and has been watched more than 1.3 million times. The officers allowed her to pump a few ounces of breast milk in the back of her car to make a bottle for them to take with her. She said, I'm just missing out on so many precious moments. I've been deprived of that and I don't know how to articulate it, but it just hurts so bad. Luckily, the infant was reunited with her parents, but not until a week later. After 7 long months and a very expensive legal battle, all while her child was being held hostage in foster care, their son, now almost 21 months old, was finally returned to his parents. In a statement released by the couple, they said, "It's a great moment to have him physically back with us, but it's not over with. We got to deal with 6 months of supervision of the state coming to our home every week for 6 months to show that we are competent and able to raise our own baby." They continued with, "We have to weigh our son. He's not allowed to lose any weight. He has to do these therapies where his play is monitored. And he has all of these follow-up appointments at the hospital where we're banned. So not exactly sure how we're going to do that yet." All of this has been a nightmare, and we are still living in a nightmare because right now we are seeing what the past 7 months has done to our son. We see it in his eyes. We see it in the way he plays. We see it in the way he tries to rest at night. This is our first time being parents, and we've been deprived of holding our babies and feeding our babies. We didn't get to hear our son say mama for the first time or see him meet his sister. After all of this, Saisha offered one piece of advice. If you're a parent, if you're a grandparent, aunt, uncle, cousin, whatever, if you're helping to raise a child, just know that in the US, we have agencies in place that have the ability to remove children without you ever breaking the law or abusing them in any way. If this can happen to us, it can happen to you. We have no criminal background. We have no history with DCFS. We have done nothing wrong. While Saisha and her family are back together, these wounds are probably ones that cut too deep to ever truly heal. What would you do if you were in an all-out battle to regain custody of your daughter, who had been medically kidnapped, was being held against her and your will in a locked psychiatric ward? She was being denied care for her debilitating chronic illnesses. You were only allowed one monitored 20-minute phone call and one supervised hour-long visit each week. And in one of the only pieces of communication you've been able to receive from your daughter, you discover a horrific hidden message. Linda Pelletier smiled as a small, carefully folded paper fortune toy thing fell out of a card sent to her by her 15-year-old daughter, Justina. Linda, remembering her daughter's fondness for the game, started playing, and as she opened her fortune flap, expecting something familiar like, "You will have a good day," instead, in the tiniest little writing, she read a heartbreaking hidden message from her daughter. "I am being tortured." In late 2012, Justina, a typical 15-year-old teenager, began experiencing horrible stomach pain, digestive problems, and all sorts of odd ailments. As part of their extensive search for answers and help, her parents took Justina to see Dr. Mark Corson, a metabolic geneticist at Tufts Medical Center. He tentatively diagnosed the teen with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome and mitochondrial disease, which is a chronic genetic disorder that can cause weakened muscles, neurological problems, even dementia. The family was working very closely with Dr. Corson, but in February of 2013, Justina's stomach felt like it was just ripping apart and her pain was unbearable. In a desperate attempt to get their daughter some immediate relief, her parents took her to Boston Children's Hospital, the award-winning and renowned teaching facility associated with Harvard. When she arrived, her pain was indescribable. She was slurring her speech, and she couldn't swallow any kind of food or drink. Instead of the care you would expect from an award-winning children's hospital, Justina was medically kidnapped when the doctors there decided that she didn't suffer from these well-documented chronic illnesses. Instead, they insisted she was experiencing somatoform disorder, which is basically like a fancy way of saying hypochondria, and it was due to Munchausen syndrome by proxy. What? In other words, forget all those tests, forget the medications, the well-documented conditions. This girl's parents have been exaggerating her health issues for so long that now she just thinks she's sick all the time. What? The doctors told the family they were going to take Justina off the mitochondrial and pain medication and wanted her instead to receive intensive psychological care. The parents were shocked and did not agree with this at all whatsoever and decided that it was time for them to leave. When they went to check Justina out of the hospital, they were stopped by security and informed that the state was taking their daughter into emergency medical custody. They were accusing the parents of medical child abuse and over medicalizing their daughter, all while neglecting to give her the psychiatric treatment she needed. Justina's parents were then removed from the hospital, banned from the property, while the state moved her from the neurology department to the locked psychiatric ward, where they then held her captive for the next 16 months. Her father later shared that we didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. For more than a year, Justina was kept behind the hospital's locked psychiatric doors, enduring various forms of experimental treatment, which included actual mental, physical, and emotional torture, all while her chronic illnesses were just ravaging her body, completely unmanaged and untreated. She was even being punished for the physical consequences that she was suffering because of the lack of treatment. She was reprimanded if she couldn't move her bowels or walk unassisted. If they forced her to walk and she fell, they would just leave her laying there in the hallway or in a bathroom for hours at a time. On the rare occasion they would allow her to use a wheelchair, they made her feet drag so it ripped out all her toenails. Staff was even assigned to harass and mock her while she showered. Stina's family was desperate to get their daughter back. They were frustrated with the lack of communication, the lack of urgency, and just the overall dismay at their situation. They began speaking out publicly about their daughter on social media and even reached out to Reverend Patrick Mahoney, the director of Christian Defense Coalition, who helped them transform their fight into a full online campaign. Justina's tough doctor, who had given her the original diagnosis, wrote a scathing letter to the court on behalf of the family, calling children's actions, and I quote, the most severe and intrusive intervention a patient can undergo. It feels like Justina's treatment team is out to prove their diagnosis at all costs. As the publicity surrounding Justina's case was gaining traction and growing, the judge ordered a gag order prohibiting the family from sharing anything to do with Justina, the hospital, or the investigation. Justina's family was desperate, so they violated the gag order and continued to share their story. As the judge got more and more strict about the gag order, Justina's campaign grabbed the attention of Martin Gatzfeld, known online as Marty G. At the time, he was a 30-year-old computer security expert and human rights activist committed to fighting for the right of institutionalized children. He had no relationship to Justina or her family, but he decided to act. Being a survivor of abuse himself, this kind of institutionalized abuse was something he was passionate about fighting. On March 20th, 2014, the infamous online group Anonymous launched Operation Justina, demanding the immediate release of Justina to her parents. Their online statement read, "We will punish all those held accountable and will not relent until Justina is free." They included the home address and phone numbers of the judge and the hospital administrator overseeing the case. 3 days later, an anonymous-style video was released on YouTube, warning the hospital again, saying failure to comply with our demands will result in retaliation of the likes you've never seen. Unfortunately, this plan kind of backfired. On March 25th, the judge decided that Justina's parents had acted irresponsibly by calling the hospital Nazis and claiming that Children's was punishing and killing Justina. He stated that the parents were engaging in concerning conduct that does not give the court any confidence that they will comply with conditions of custody. He then awarded permanent custody of Justina to the Massachusetts DCFS. This was not the response anyone wanted or expected. It wasn't even rational. In April, when Justina had still not been released, Marty G coordinated an online sit-in during the hospital's largest annual fundraiser. The sit-in caused their sites to crash, making the hospital's fundraiser fairly unsuccessful. In a statement to the Huffington Post in 2016, Marty stated, "I'd have to hit children where they appeared to care most, pocketbook and reputation. All other efforts to protect Justina weren't succeeding and time was of the essence." Almost unbelievably, they kept their donation page on the same public network as the rest of their stuff. Rookie mistake. He knew that patient and medical records would not be affected by this cyber sit-in, but it would get the hospital's attention while ensuring that they were thoroughly embarrassed. After months of public outcry and the complete lack of evidence of any kind of abuse by her parents, it was a short film from Justina that finally moved the courts to action. Her older sister helped her secretly shoot a 45-second video inside the facility. In the video, you can see Justina pleading with the judge to reverse his decision. In a weak and shaking voice, Justina's heard saying, "All I really want to be home with my family and friends. You can do it. You're the one that's judging this. Please let me go home." Despite 16 months of the hospital insisting that her symptoms were in her head, it was painfully clear that Justina's health had only worsened during her forced stay and that no amount of psychiatric treatment had improved her conditions. On June 17th of 2014, just a few days after Justina was able to release the video, the judge finally dismissed the child protection case against Lou and Linda, citing credible evidence that circumstances had changed. Justina was able to return home the next day. The hospital's abuse, torture, and refusal to treat her chronic conditions created lifelong consequences for Justina, like post-traumatic stress symptoms, becoming wheelchair-bound, and the mental anguish of not just the abuse, but of the knowledge that they were able to abuse her legally. After Justina's release, Reverend Mahoney pointed to the power of online activism. He said, "Giving God all the credit, and this couldn't have happened without the internet." When Marty G found out, his only thought was mission accomplished. However, in 2014, the FBI began an investigation into the cyber attacks on the hospital's computer network and traced the original YouTube video calling for help for Justina back to Marty G's account. He admitted that he didn't bother covering his tracks because he didn't think he was doing anything wrong. The FBI arrested him on February 17, 2016, but it wasn't until January of 2019 that the judge finally sentenced Martin to pay $443,000 in restitution, sentenced him to 121 months in prison, to be followed by 3 years of supervised release. The judge also added a couple extra restrictions to his imprisonment time, like only being allowed 2 15-minute calls a week between him and his wife. He would be required to stay in his cell for 22 hours a day. They refused to allow any kind of media interviews or phone calls, and eventually they even cut off his right to use the prison email system. Justina and her family filed a malpractice suit against Boston Children's Hospital in 2016. After a 5-week trial in 2020, sadly, and I have to say shockingly, the jury found that Boston Children's Hospital was not negligent in their care of Justina. Now, you may have heard of a lot or a little of Justina's case, but I shared it because what you also have to know and understand is what happened with Martin, because it explains why and how medical kidnapping is continuing to happen. Martin was convicted the same way Justina and so many others are medically kidnapped. Connections, ego, and a loose interpretation of certain laws. These issues are deep and they're systemic. We all think this would never happen to us, but so did Justina, her family, and Martin.
Thank you for being here, my friend. Next week, we'll hear exactly what happened to Martin and the incredibly high price he paid fighting for someone he had never even met. I have a few more stories to share with you, but most importantly, we're going to talk about the 10 things that you need to know to keep you and your family safe in any medical